Look at that. All right. So I've just started the recording. My name is Angela Gupta. I'm a University of Minnesota Extension forester, and I'm also one of the leaders of the Forest Pest First Detector program. And for the second year in a row, we have decided to do online learning this year because of the pandemic. And so this is our first of a 4-part coffee and chat series. So I'm going to go around and first have the instructors do their introductions. So I'm going to have Monica Chandler and Matt Russell do introductions. I'll start with Monica and go to Matt. So Monica.
Hi, good morning. I'm Monica Chandler. I'm with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's Noxious and Invasive Weed Program.
Excellent. And then Matt, it's you.
Good morning. I'm Matt Russell. I'm an extension specialist at the University of Minnesota, based on the St. Paul campus.
Excellent. And then I do think we can reasonably go around and very quickly introduce ourselves. So in the chat, I have just dropped, I'm hoping, when I do this, you know what? I think we're going to not do that, actually. It's really hard to facilitate and it takes kind of a lot of time. But if you want to drop in that information in the chat, so we'll know your name already. So where you are, where you work, and then what you're hoping to learn today, that would be super great. And I can help get that information out to the facilitators. And if you do at some point take your microphone off of mute, you can tell us your name and who you're with. So a couple of just gentle reminders, please keep your microphone on mute unless you're speaking. We will be taking questions through the chat and I will facilitate that. So you can type in a question and I will do my best to get it before the speakers in a timely manner. Or you can raise your hand, and the hand feature is under reactions. It's in the bottom right corner for me, and it is the bottommost large button is raise your hand. But you are welcome to use the reactions if you would like to cheer for them, give them a thumbs up or applause. You can do all of those things. So with that, I am going to turn it over to, I believe Monica is going to begin to chat with us first. So Monica, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, good morning, everyone. So what we're going to talk about today is a tactical plan that was developed to address this question of what do we do with invasive plant species that are widespread in Minnesota? Do we throw up our hands and say, oh, they're everywhere, there's nothing we can do? Or do we really look at the problem in more detail and see if we can tease out what can we do and where does it make the most sense to do that? So that's really what we were looking at with this project. And it was actually many different organizations participated in this project. So it was led by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and University of Minnesota, but there were many other agency partners such as DNR and Board of Water and Soil Resources who participated. So it was a large effort. With that, we can dive in, I think. It's not there. Okay, just figuring out how to advance the slides here. So we're really looking at prioritizing where and when invasive plant management is done. We accept that there are insufficient resources to control all of the infestations in Minnesota. And so how can we best spend the limited funding and other resources that we have? So we were looking at this at more of a local level. So the state priorities remain focused on the prohibited eradicate species on the noxious weed list. So these are species that are not widespread in the state and are highly damaging. But because they're not widespread, we have an opportunity to control and hopefully eradicate these species before they become widespread. So the species that we're focused on with the tactical plan are species that are much more abundant in Minnesota, and many of the species will be familiar to you. There is an actual plan document. For the most part, we challenged ourselves with trying to write a plan without a whole lot of heavy wording, which turned out to be interesting and it was definitely a challenge, but we thought creating a large document with a lot of text is not so much what people would be utilizing. So you'll see we looked at some other tools such as creating maps and utilizing them in story maps and creating graphics of things like life cycles and what to do, like what treatments to do when. But there is a document that can be referred to, especially if people really want to dive into the methodology of what was done here. So here's a list of the target plant species. So I expect many of them are quite familiar to most of you. And I'm going to run through this with wild parsnip as an example. So wild parsnip is a biennial species. It's the same parsnip as we eat. So what you buy in the store is the same genus and species as wild parsnip that has escaped this cultivation and become widespread in many areas of Minnesota. And one of the big problems with wild parsnip is that if the sap gets on skin and that skin is exposed to light, then it can cause blistering that's very painful and can be recurring. So the blisters might heal and then they're exposed to light again and they could potentially recur. So really big human health issue with this plant. And it's not just human health, like other mammals can suffer from wild parsnip burns as well. So wild parsnip is a biennial. It reproduces exclusively by seed. So as we go through this and we think about management, management is really focused on preventing the production and dispersal of seed. That is really the focus of management efforts, specifically for wild parsnip. And now I'm going to turn it over to Matt because Matt and his team did the really heavy lifting on a lot of the models that are behind this project. So he can explain them.
Great. Well, thank you, Monica. Yeah, as Monica said, we're of course very interested in knowing where these plants are, and not just knowing where they are, but where they could be as we look into the future and as we integrate information like environmental data to that. And so this is the map we've found, or we've created of wild parsnip, kind of separated out between the four kind of broad geographic regions of the state. And we know where wild parsnip is through information like EDDMaps. That's the reporting tool for many of these invasive plants that a lot of people in invasive plant management use and a lot of researchers use. They're on the ground measurements. We know where these plants are located. Because we're also interested in forests, we can also get data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. That's through the Forest Service. There's about 6,000 FIA plots across the state. And a subset of those, we have information on invasive plants, where they are and if they're not there. And so kind of just by that, you know, we know where, as an example, wild parsnip is. But we also know if we know where it is, well, we know the kind of environmental conditions where parsnip grows. And so we understand the soils, the topography, and the climate, and how that might shape where we might find wild parsnip in areas where it's not found today. And so we underwent a mapping effort to provide kind of a landscape level overview of, in this case, wild parsnip, but also for, I think, 11 other species as a part of the tactical plan. And so next slide. And so that's all well and good. We have all this data to kind of inform us where it is and what factors, environmental factors, might lead to where it could be. And so we use a tool called multi-criteria decision analysis. And so this integrated basically all of the information we have on the species in a GIS and in a modeling framework to understand and to quantify where we should treat wild parsnip. And so what you see in the yellow in the map are areas where we deemed it high priority to treat. And a lot of that's the metro and southern Minnesota, but it also goes into the northern part of Minnesota, into St. Louis County and even really far north. And so that didn't just take into account where wild parsnip is today, but it also took into account some other things that we asked some stakeholders about the economic benefits, the land cover, how close these areas were to high biodiversity areas, how close these are to trails, given the relationship between trails and roads to the presence of invasive plants. And so this multi-criteria decision analysis allowed us to integrate all that information to come up with a priority treatment map that you're seeing here for wild parsnip. Next slide, Monica. And then as we did that, we are also interested in understanding the kind of cost-benefit analysis of treating, in our case, parsnip in this example, but all of the 12 different species that we looked at. And so this is work, there was a lot of, like any economic analysis, a lot of assumptions and a lot of things going into this. And this was really the work of Bill Lazarus in our applied economics department on campus. But his reasoning was to kind of look at infestation control at 10,000 random locations, just kind of randomly assigned across the state. And if 25% of the funds were needed to control all of the infestations that were there, what the model did was it basically focused that control on the highest priority infestations that would yield the same amount if we were to use all the money to 100% of the funds in that area. And so we kind of called this a net gain approach because it tried to target the highest priority infestations. And so this is a pretty common economic analysis that we use for some of the noxious weeds that we looked at here. Next slide. And then so with that, we were able to identify those areas where parsnip is expanding and prioritize those areas. Kind of Monica has kind of referred to these as the leading edges or the invasion fronts of some of these invasive plants. And so we see kind of the treatment priority area in the map, and we can kind of overlay that with some of the information we know about the confirmed locations of those species. And we can get a better sense of where those invasion fronts might be. So we might target the edges of those fronts if we're thinking about trying to contain the spread of some of these invasive plants, to be more tactical in our management of these plants. So next slide. And we do have, if you want to look more or read more about the work that we've done, I'll add the paper there in chat. It's an open access paper, and so you should be able to view it just fine. Obviously myself, I'm in the Department of Forest Resources, so we did a really thorough analysis on 5 species that are of concern in our forests. And so we did common buckthorn, glossy buckthorn, garlic mustard, multiflora rose, and knotweeds as an example. And Jason Reinhardt, who is now with the U.S. Forest Service, he really led this effort and was really the machine behind getting all of these maps and prioritizations put together. So if you're interested in forests, if you're interested in learning more about our process, I'll share the link there in chat. Next slide.
All right, back to me.
Yep.
All right. So what we did was we took this information from these statewide maps and we broke it down by region, in part so that we could, this was actually driven by workshops and having workshops where we focused on species that were important to that region. And so we broke the state down into 4 different regions and then looked at the prioritization maps and figured out which plants were priorities in these different regions. And interestingly, Canada thistle did not come out as a management priority anywhere. And that's because Canada thistle has been around in Minnesota for a long, long time. And it has basically moved to the locations where it could. There really weren't like invasion fronts or areas where we would think, gosh, I've got to stop this plant from moving into this area. It's moved. So it no longer, we don't get those net gains from managing Canada thistle. And I'm saying that from a statewide perspective. I'm not saying that as an individual farmer. You know, an individual farmer might see a lot of gains for controlling Canada thistle in a pasture, for example. But I'm looking at this from, you know, statewide or regional level in terms of management gains. So we can see that there are different species that were priorities in different areas. And one thing about Northeast Minnesota is that many of the areas of high biodiversity significance are in the Northeast. And also many of these species are not that abundant in the Northeast. So it ended up with a much longer list of priority species than some of the other regions. And those were some of the drivers. So in order to, we identify where we should be working, but we also worked on best management practices and pulling together pieces of information from literature, from people who have worked a lot with these species, and created visuals for what management should be done at what time. And specifically with wild parsnip, we were hearing from researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that their studies showing that mowing wild parsnip at the time of flowering of the secondary inflorescence. So when that begins flowering, if you mow at that time, in the upper Midwest, there's not sufficient time for wild parsnip to develop seed. So if we go back to thinking about wild parsnip management, that's exactly what we're trying to do. The plant can grow, it can flower, but that seed will not mature in time before a frost will take out the plant. So when I talk to people about timing at the secondary inflorescence, they would ask me, what is a secondary inflorescence? And so we thought, let's put some visuals to this so that it's more clear, like what stages we're talking about. And so that was really the idea behind these life cycle graphics. So there's a set of these graphics available for your use. And Angie will put in a link to a GIS hub that includes links to all these graphics. And they're also on our individual species web pages for the noxious weeds that we worked on this project with. So, so treatment timing is an important part. So in order to really realize these net gains, not only did we have to work in the priority areas, but we also had to do management well. And that's where timing which treatment is done when and how becomes really important. And we're going to get some additional help with this in terms of treatment timing for knotweeds and wild parsnip with a research project that's currently underway with the University of Minnesota's Terrestrial Invasive Plants and Pest Center. They're looking at phenology of these plants. And so they're having, and maybe some of you are involved in this project, they're having volunteers track the growth and development of wild parsnip and Japanese knotweed and the hybrid Bohemian knotweed throughout the growing season. And they are also collecting data at research and outreach centers to better understand this growth and development, and then eventually develop maps that will be available online that will be a bit like weather maps that can tell us what the developmental stage of these plants are in and really help guide treatment timing so that we can be informed about, well, wild parsnips, flowering in the south. And so it'll begin flowering soon in the north, and just give us those better ideas of what to do, when and where. And so Angie will put in a link for the GIS hub where you can find these story maps and you can find these life cycle graphics. And so you can explore those on your own and utilize those materials as you like. And so then we talk about implementing this tactical plan, and it's a big undertaking. So what we'd like to do is increase management efforts in these priority areas, and that means more funding is needed. So my agency is working with our Noxious Weed Advisory Committee in order to, we're really trying to seek more long-term stable funding for people doing invasive plant management. We're well aware of how hard it is to just be trying to do this on grant to grant cycles, and you might get money one year and not another. And it's really hard to have a weed program that is so in fits and starts. We're also looking to train people to identify these species and then really do that correct application to maximize efficacy. And this is something that we're learning as we go. We get information from land managers that helps us improve best management practices. And then we really want to solicit feedback from regional partners to see, is this working for you or not? What do we need to change? And with that, we can wrap up and have discussion and answer questions and, hear your thoughts. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Monica and Matt. That was super great. So there have been no questions in the chat and there are no hands raised. But I'm going to give folks about 5 seconds to type. And if there's still nothing, I'll ask a question myself.
I can make a comment on the economic portion of this, which was the hardest part to do. The economist really had a rough time because there wasn't a lot of information for him to work on in terms of like, what were the impacts of these species. That's not documented well, certainly not economically. And what were all the benefits of control were a little bit easier to calculate, but they were still challenging without really knowing the impact. So there's a big need for economic research that we really found as we went through this project.
Yeah, thanks. As being a part of that team, I remember those conversations. So let's see. So there's a question, and it came to me directly, but I'll go ahead and read it. So I have never encountered the burn from parsnip. Is it worse than poison ivy? Would like to have, and then there's a question about having access to Monica's literature.
Oh, interesting. Let's take those in two parts. So if I forget the second part about literature, please remind me. So the burns of wild parsnip can vary a lot by individuals. So we react differently to poison ivy as individuals. We react differently to wild parsnip. Some people don't get much reaction to poison ivy. I do. But I'm kind of a middle of the road person. There are other people who, they go straight to their doctor when they get poison ivy. So there's a wide range. And the same thing can happen with wild parsnip. It also matters how the quantity of sap that you get on your skin and how long that's exposed to the light. So there are different factors. And literature, I guess it would be helpful to learn like what literature somebody's after specifically. I mean, I'm happy to share what I have, but could we get more clarification on what literature, like for a given species, or what specifically is somebody interested in?
Excellent, thanks. And then there's a comment. So Maureen is a tree care advisor volunteer, and she'd be interested in volunteering for looking for and monitoring these weeds. Do you need volunteers?
Oh, yay. That's great. So there's a project called the Pesky Plant Trackers. And I wonder if we could get a link into the chat. I can look.
I put a link in there, so that was a good advertisement.
Oh, terrific.
Yes, yeah. I didn't exactly explain it though. So if you want to, say a few words, that would be appropriate.
Yeah, so that's part of this other project where they're tracking the phenology of these plants. And they had a meeting yesterday where one of the leaders with the National Phenology Network, is that correct? Talked about the project and how much good data is coming in that's really enabling them to do interesting visualizations with the data, to look at it in different ways and see, to try and look at different areas of the state and how development goes in these different areas. Like, is there a big difference between southern Minnesota and northern Minnesota, and just looking at the data in all different ways, and that these data will feed into these much larger models and will be available for use by researchers. And so that's all done with through the National Phenology Network. I hope I got that name right. I know it's got national and phenology.
I think it's right, but
Okay.
so again, feel free to raise your hand. The button on my screen, it's the bottom right under reactions. If you just click on that, then it will be the bottom large button. I do have another question in the chat though. And so, or you of course can type in the chat. My exposure to wild parsnip caused just a dark stain on my skin that took over a week to fade away. Others can get actual burns.
There, like if you do encounter wild parsnip and do get burned, or get the sap on your skin, you could wash it off with soap and water, and that would really help prevent a burn. The other thing you can do is cover it up. So like if it's on your arm and you're wearing a short sleeve shirt, if you have a long sleeve shirt and could put it on, that's another thing you can do to prevent that burn from happening.
Okay, so there's a comment here. So I hear many comments about Canadian thistle not being controlled by Minnesota Department of Transportation in the state highway road ditches and large areas of state parks and refuge. I assume cost or funding priorities is the reason. Are these areas a priority?
I hear those comments too, Gary. I get calls about those as well. Canada thistle can really it's one that does catch a lot of attention, especially when the fluffy seed is flying in the late summer, early fall. There can be concern about it, although Canada thistle no longer causes the problems to agriculture. It can in pastures, but not in row crop agriculture like it used to. So Canada thistle used to be extremely problematic in row cropping systems, and now it is no longer because of the herbicides that are used to control weeds in these cropping systems. So it's no longer doing as much economic damage. And then in natural areas, what we hear from land managers is that over time, Canada thistle tends to just fall out of the mix as they do restorations. If disturbance favors Canada thistle. So it's not necessarily as problematic as it used to be. So it's not the priority that it used to be as well. And it is so widespread, like MnDOT wouldn't have a budget to control it.
So there's a comment in the chat about a certain type of soap working well to wash poison ivy off that might work for poison hemlock. So you all can look there. So I'm going to ask a question. So Monica or Matt, how do you hope people will use these maps on all of these documents in the tactical plan?
Do you want to take that first, Matt?
Sure, I'll take a first stab. Yeah, I mean, I think with respect to the maps, I mean, we know that pretty much all invasive plant management is done locally, but it's sometimes I think the maps will help to kind of see, the forest or the landscape at the 30,000 foot level. And so I think it's really important to understand, what they're doing in the next county over, the issues they're dealing with. So I think the maps can help in that way to get a better sense of kind of where your local forest or your local property or whatever you're managing sits within the whole ecosystem. I think too, I'll just make a plug again for those life cycle graphs. I found them to be really, really great ones to share with the public. I know many of you work with the public on an everyday basis. They're really simple. They got great visuals, and sharing them with folks can really help to send the message about management in a really effective way, I think. So do head over and download a couple of those, print them off in color. They're just a great resource to share with folks.
Yeah, and then so I'll talk about this from both my agency's perspective and then our partners' perspective. So which have been a little bit different. So my agency is very interested in using these maps to justify why more funding is needed for invasive plant management. That we are really trying to realize this high economic net gain with doing this priority management and really protecting these areas of high biodiversity significance And so it helps us to make a case for why our local partners need more funding to do this work, that's essential. So that's one viewpoint of, how my agent is looking to use this information. And then from partners, when presenting this to local land managers, what I hear is, can I get a GIS layer of those maps? Because I want to talk to my county board and show them that I'm really working on these priority areas. Or I want to apply for grant money and I want to show that this is really important in this area. So that's some feedback that we've had from people who are utilizing these maps.
Excellent. Thanks, Monica. So there's another question in the chat. Do the list of invasives include updates on species that may be declared invasive?
Could you read that again, please?
Yeah. Do the list of invasives include updates on species that may be declared invasive?
We are not set to update this. That's something that we had talked about, but without additional funding, we really don't have a mechanism for updating this or keeping things real time, which is something to consider going forward. That, could we secure funding for an ongoing effort or adding additional species?
All right. Well, people are hopefully putting their questions or comments in the chat or raising their hand. I have a different one. So I agree with Matt. I want to give a plug for those visuals. The life cycle visuals in particular are really spectacular. And so, Monica, have you seen any particularly interesting uses for those?
I've seen them posted like on some shop walls and things like that, so that people just can see them and keep track of what to do at what stage. But I think with COVID, I have not seen as much use of things as I would have otherwise. I do field work, but not nearly as much contact with weed managers at the local level as I wish I had and used to have.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, Monica, I dropped you a personal chat, but really, I was wondering if it would be worth taking over doing a tour of the resources on your desktop. If you're not comfortable, I could potentially do that, or Matt could, but that might be worth it. There's a lot of information in that resource.
Sure. Okay, let's see if I can. I think I'm going to have to share a different screen, so we'll see. I think I know what to do. I just have to pull it all together.
No, that's fine. And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask a question of Matt. So Matt was involved in all of this work, and I'm just curious to know what you thought the biggest surprise was when doing this project.
Yeah, it's a great question. The lack of data, I think, was a big thing. We have, with the EDMAPS locations and with the FIA data that we used, we had a lot of the distribution data covered, but to what Monica brought up, there's just not really a ton of information about the impacts of these plants at an economic level, which is really surprising when you think about wild parsnip and all the human health problems it has, or when you think about buckthorn and all of the problems that it has, and in degrading ecosystems. So, not being able to find enough information to really come up with a really detailed economic analysis, I think, was a surprise to us. But on the other hand, we had to make some assumptions about the modeling efforts that we did, but not having a lot of data on some of these species, I think, came as a bit surprise to us.
Yeah, thanks. I actually had exactly the same surprise. I wasn't maybe quite as surprised, but it is still shocking. So thank you for that. And hopefully we bought Monica some time. Do you want to answer that, Monica?
Yeah, the economist on the project said each one of these species, like I could have multiple graduate students on each one of these trying to really understand the economic impacts. So it is hard to do cost benefit analysis when you don't have that economic information. So I think we really highlighted a big research need, and maybe that's something that could be addressed going forward. So on this GIS hub, we have these story map collections by region, and that might not be working for everyone right now. We have a bit of a glitch with that. I can bring them up and they work on my computer, but they might not work on yours. So if they don't, we're aware of the problem as of like 2 days ago, and we'll get it fixed. But the rest of the links on this page should work fine. So here are the individual story maps. If you're interested, you can see what story maps are. Story maps are kind of like a presentation it's like it can involve interactive mapping and pictures and things. So here we have common buckthorn. I think it's taking a while to load. I think what we're seeing here is my internet speed. And so I don't know if I can close that out. So what we have here is common buckthorn identification, distribution, infestation examples, and then a life cycle graphic for common buckthorn. But one of the things we tried to do was explain, like when we talked about high, medium, and low levels of infestation, that we all might have our own ideas of what that means. So we tried to include some photos of what would be like a generally infested area versus like a leading edge or a really isolated population where it's really hard to find, like in this example, it's a few buckthorn saplings coming up in an otherwise uninfested forest in northern Minnesota. So you know what these look like and where
Go back
these
to that low
species
infestation
currently
one, will you,
are.
Monica? It took a while to load, but then it was, I always love that picture. Can you go back? I think we just have to.
Yeah. I think one of the problems
There
is
you
my
go.
internet.
Yep. Just pause right there. Because it's kind of, I mean, I always find it, I don't know that shocking is quite the right word, but an excellent reminder at how it's so easy to miss these things at these low infestation rates.
And I think the next, is there a next picture there? Yeah. So there you can see the little buckthorn saplings highlighted, and you could just see how hard I would probably walk right past them. And I have an eye for buckthorn, but you know, it's really easy to miss this stuff.
Thank you, Monica. Thanks for placating me.
Yeah, and so so you can explore these on your own and just get a good idea for these species, how to identify them. There are photos of different stages and different parts, and we focused a lot on underground parts of plants as well that are really important for management, but that aren't included in a lot of identification or management types of resources. So we ended up digging up a lot of plants and drawing them for things like the life cycle graphics, because it becomes very important to know if you have these underground stems running out from plants like knotweed, so that when you're trying to manage something like a knotweed, you're trying to get, if you're using a herbicide, to get that herbicide translocated throughout that underground stem network. So, so it was kind of a fun part of the project where we did a lot of digging and comparing what we were finding as we, in different parts of the state, were digging up different plants.
All right, still don't see any additional questions or comments or raised hands, so I'll ask another one. So, Monica, I feel like I've heard hopes and dreams that people will use this data as they apply for various funding sources. I'm thinking of like SSMA and Cooperative Weed Management Area funding opportunities and others. Have you seen that? Are you hoping for that?
Yeah, well, so two ways in terms of like trying to secure funding, like we put in um, a supplemental budget request for funding and really saying we're looking to fund local partners to do this work and work in these priority areas. So that has moved forward in terms of an application. And we do share this information with as like a request for proposals would go out, we would share this information showing, where these priorities have been identified. Um, so so we hope that our local partners will use this information, or if it's not useful to them, then it's helpful for us to hear that too. Like, well, what can we do to make this useful to local partners?
Excellent, thank you. So there's a comment, I guess. I'll go ahead and read it. So several of my neighbors have burning bush as a hedge. It's not loose in the neighborhood yet, but I would love some paper literature to share with these neighbors about it becoming invasive.
So we have a web page on burning bush where burning bush is being phased out of production and then will become a restricted noxious weed because it is escaping cultivation. And let me tell you, I had burning bush in my front yard and liked it and have since removed it. But, it's a process for us all to go through. And so many people are just not aware that burning bush is a problem. So I can see wanting to give them information about this. We do not have printed information on burning bush, but I think some other states do. I think I'll have to look for it. So maybe Angie, if you could get
Matt and I were both Johnny on the spot with that one. It was pretty funny. Almost synchronistically, we dropped that website in there.
Okay. Okay, so you found another source for burning bush?
Well, we dropped in yours, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's.
I want to say that Indiana actually has some brochures that could potentially be printed, but I'm not sure if it's Indiana. I'd have to look it up. But I know there are some other states where burning bush has been a problem for longer. Oh, and the Midwest Invasive Plant Network might have something too. I would just have to do some digging around. So if I could get the contact information, then I could dig around and send that. Or we could send it to everybody as a follow-up, if you like, Angie.
Either way, I can pull the contact.
Yeah, and Maureen, it does look like there's a fact sheet on that webpage that we shared in the right section, kind of up above, that can be printed out. I don't know how it would look if it's printed, but if you're thinking about handing it to folks that you're working with, that might kind of be a printer-friendly version of that webpage.
So she appreciates the information and will also do some digging. All right. So just a reminder, everybody on this call, you have Matt and Monica at your disposal. So ask them your questions, make your comments. This is a great time to just get feedback from these two. I was a partner on this project, and it was a great project. Lots of meetings, lots of modeling, lots of really sort of new space for me. So it was all very interesting. And this was one of those projects that I feel like didn't roll out quite the way everyone had expected because of the pandemic.
Yeah, we had planned in-person workshops to go look at these advancing fronts, and which often don't look like much. It can be like a single tansy plant in a field, and that is an invasion front, and it looks like nothing. But that's exactly what you want people to go see and have a chance to to see these plants in person. And so we had like field trips planned that we had to cancel. And I love field trips, so I was so sad about that. So yeah, certainly the pandemic changed how we had to do things.
Yeah, I will make a plug too on that larger website that Monica was going through. There's one section where they're separated out by region, so you can look at the plants that we've identified. Monica had that table with kind of for each of our 4 regions which plants we have a part of the plan, and so those are a part of that that website as well. So as you're looking to just hone in on your local area, it's right there. Those story maps are just awesome things to share.
And I will say this information is presented in a story map platform, which is a little different. It's not just your standard website. And so in that way, it's actually really slick and sort of beautiful. And there's a lot of great information in there, but it is a little different as you kind of meander through it. So it's maybe worth spending a few minutes just going through there and discovering all of the great resources. So Maureen says, since no one else is asking, she's going to ask, what's the status of oak wilt in central Minnesota? So this is a different question. Anybody feel brave enough to answer this one?
Angie, could you or Matt take that as foresters?
I might punt that one to you, Angie, because you had that citizen science project last year. So if you want to take it, go for it.
Yeah, so I was wondering. So sure, we did look at Cass and Crow Wing counties for oak wilt last summer using citizen science, and the citizen science component wasn't the most successful, but they did, I do believe, maybe Matt can pull up or dig around quick for the new oak wilt areas. I do believe oak wilt was found in Cass and Crow Wing ultimately. And so it is spreading sort of slowly through central Minnesota, and it is a big priority for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. So the DNR, not the MDA, leads that effort, but they are definitely on the lookout in much of central Minnesota for oak wilt. So if you think you've found it, please report that to your local DNR office. You can always report it, as with all invasive species, to EDDMAPS as well. So I'll just drop in EDDMAPS. But that's essentially, I think, the long and short of the update. If anybody wants to add to that.
I'll just add, there's a lot of concern, especially the bur oak has a really wide range in Minnesota, especially as you go north. And so, there's concern as it kind of moves north into Crow Wing County. That's a lot. It's a very, a lot of people travel to the Brainerd Lakes area and that area. And so, whether or not it got there through, people moving firewood to campsites, I don't know that we know, but there's a lot of concern that it, not unlike emerald ash borer, kind of getting into our forests in the north, concern about it spreading. Oak wilt can spread too by, severe storms. And so folks working in the Pine County area about 10 years ago, that's how we think that it spread to Pine County, was through a large windstorm that happened back in 2011 through the St. Croix State Forest, St. Croix State Park area. And so it's not just kind of people moving firewood, but can also be exposing, we tell landowners and homeowners not to prune oaks, in the spring and summer. Part of the reason is because those beetles are attracted to fresh wood that's hard, that's cut, and that can happen in a blowdown or some wind event. So a lot of concern among foresters about the spread of oak wilt going north.
I'll also give a little pitch. So we were on a call recently with the DNR, and people always want to know when they can trim their oaks, and this right now is the time when there's essentially almost no risk for trimming your oaks. And it's a really great time to see your trees. Without the leaves, you can really see the structure a lot better. So if you have trees that need a little structural pruning, a little work, this is the perfect time to do that. And some people will push back. It's cold and it doesn't feel right. I will tell you, man, I think it is so lovely to work out in the woods this time of year. There are no insects to trouble you. You can walk across tricky landscapes on snowshoes quite easily. You rarely get super sweaty out there. You're never dripping and feeling real muggy. And then frankly, you're kind of protected in your winter wear. So you want to always be careful when you're trimming and you're taking trees down. But there's a little extra protection from scrapes and things like that. It's hard to get to me in my winter wear. So there's my plug for pruning this time of year. And the sort of very abnormal December tornadoes were a mess, of course, but it's actually a good time to trim trees. So if you had any damage from those big windstorms that came through in mid-December, again, this would be the perfect time to go ahead and take care of that. All right, so we are winding down. We have 8 minutes. And so I'm going to start dropping in a couple of links. So one, I would like to advertise our upcoming coffee and chat. So that link is about to go in here. On this link, you can, of course, see where to register. We are registering individually for each workshop. So registering just for one does not get you everywhere. You need to register for each one individually. But I think that's going to be a good move for us. The very next one I will say is drought and its impacts on pine beetles. Of course, thinking about that after last year's very dry season. Thinking of oak wilt. Oak wilt is March 9th. Oak wilt updates and cost share programs. I forgot to say the date. Drought is February 10th. And then our final one is jumping worms with a focus on forest. That's April 12th. So those are all upcoming. Any more questions? I don't see any raised hands. All right. Then I will go ahead and drop in the evaluation link for today's webinar. So that is a short evaluation. I would be really grateful if you were to quickly fill that out. And then there will be one more. I'm looking at any. What was the talk in April, says Deb. Yeah, that's jumping worms in our forests. And so there's a lot of conversation about invasive jumping worms. If you're unfamiliar with those, that conversation will talk specifically about jumping worms and their impacts in forests. And then the question was, what was the date again? So the date for April is May 12th from 9 to 10. That is a Tuesday. So because of some presenter planning purposes, not all of them are the same day of the week. They bounce around a smidge. But jumping worms is going to be April 12th, which is a Tuesday. And then finally, as we get to about 5 minutes out, I'm delighted that we have CEU, continuing education credits available for Society of American Foresters, Minnesota Forest Stewardship Plan Writers, and International Society of Arboriculture. So if you need CEUs, you need to fill out that link that I just dropped in. We cannot give you CEUs unless you fill out that link, and we cannot give them for recordings. So you need to do that now. So again, just dropped into the chat, the handout for Future Forest First Detector Coffee and Chats, the evaluation for today, and the CEU credits. So by my clock, we have about 5 more minutes. So we can absolutely take a couple more questions if anyone has any. So if not, I will do a little bit more of a download, a little advertisement. So drought and impact on pine needles. I'm happy to say that the new forest health specialist at the DNR, Megan O'Neill, will be doing that presentation. And I think that'll be well worth it, right? So as we have a changing climate, we're going to see more droughts and more floods, sort of back and forth. And so understanding how that climate condition impacts our pine beetles, I think will become quite important. So I'm looking forward to that one. Oak wilt, as we've already heard today, there's always interest in oak wilt, and this will also include information about cost share. So just know that's coming up March 9th. And then finally, jumping worms. Jumping worms were a pretty big deal last year. I expect they will be a very big deal this year. And Lee Freilich at the University of Minnesota and others at University of Minnesota or University of Wisconsin-Madison have been doing quite a bit of work on jumping worms and their impacts on forests, different from landscapes, gardens, and tended areas. So looking forward to all those. And I forgot to say, but Brian Schwengel from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources will be doing the oak wilt. And he is kind of the state authority on oak wilt. And then I'll be doing the jumping worms presentation in April. All right, so we will hang out here for a few more minutes if people need to access these links. And again, happy to field any final questions or thoughts. You guys have been a very quiet group. It's always a little bit hard to know how this will go. And when you're done with these evaluations, CEU forms, and hopefully registering for future workshops, everyone is kind of welcome to go. We hope you have a great Wednesday and stay healthy. Tell you that feels like a trick at my house and when we're not doing well. And I want to give a big shout out. Thank you to Monica and Matt for being our first for 2022. It always feels like I have to, grease up the wheels again and start thinking about this a little differently. So thank you guys for being the first. I thought this was really great. And I'm excited to get this tactical plan out before people again. I do feel like it was a bit of a soft rollout when it came out. The world was really wrapped up in COVID at the time. And Gary Wyatt didn't get a chance to introduce himself. He was having a few technical difficulties in the beginning, but he is also one of our Forest Best First Protector team members, and he is generally a really great helper during these workshops. So he's here, and I want to give him a little shout out. So you're getting some thank yous in the chats, and yep, people are starting to leave, and that is all fine. And so presenters, I have another meeting in 1 minute. So I will just tell you that by my count, 29 people registered, 25 people showed. So that is quite good. And in the notes for today's, I dropped in the questions in case that's useful. So those are in our calendar entry presenters. So people are dropping off fast and furious. Yeah, thanks.
Do you have the contact information for the person who was interested in literature?
I can definitely get it. Yes, I will drop it in there and I'll send you an email.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So thanks are starting to roll in. Send to all was links about the next workshops, and I will do that. Excellent. All right. It is 10 o'clock, everybody. You guys did great. I think I have another meeting with Matt here up next. So have a great day, everybody. I'm going to turn this off. Thank you.
All right. Bye.